Welcome to another collection of horrible fates. In today's final story, I'm going to play a short video that is one of the most distressing things that I have ever covered on this channel. It's not graphic or anything like that, but immediately upon seeing it, you will understand exactly what I mean. As such, viewer discretion is strongly advised. When you're in bear country, there are a few rules that are absolutely crucial to follow to be safe. This depends a little bit on the types of bears you might see, but for the most part, the principles are the same. Generally, you're simply best avoiding encounters if possible. To do this, the advice always given is to make your presence known, not to smell strongly of food, and to be sure you're not surprising any bears. Now, unless you're just doing a short hike, you will almost always have some food with you, especially if you're camping. So the recommendation when camping is to keep and cook your food and garbage away from your campsite. But if this is a remote campsite or one without any, you're supposed to hang your food from a tree away from your campsite and high enough for a bear not to be able to reach it. Just keeping away from the site isn't always helpful because if the bear gets a hold of it, then it's more likely to stick around or to return to look for more. And you should do all of this because the last thing you want is a massive grizzly walking around outside of your tent in the middle of the night. In July of 2021, 65-year-old retired nurse Leia was completing the legendary Great Scenic Divide mountain biking route. As a native of Southern California, Leia loved to surf and horseback ride, but her favorite hobby was biking. She had biked all of her adult life, but once she retired, she had way more time to do all sorts of extended trips and even some competitions. In fact, in 2015, she won the Mammoth Enduro Championship in the women's 60 and over category. She was just in phenomenal shape, and so one of her next big projects was this 2,700-mile bike route that runs all the way from the Canadian Rockies in Alberta to the Mexican border. Along the way, bikers gain and lose over 200,000 feet of elevation, and the route generally takes between 6 and 10 weeks, and Leia was doing this all at the age of 65. About 8 days into this trip, Leia had already traveled 500 miles through the gorgeous Rockies, along dirt and gravel pathways, through the forests and by lakes. Sometimes she was completely off-grid, and other times she was biking through little mountain towns. But either way, she was loving it. She even messaged one of her friends that this was the happiest she'd ever been. On that 8th day, on July 6th, she stopped in one of these little mountain towns called Ovanda in Montana. In this entire town, there are just 4 streets, 1 school, 1 post office, and lots of mountains to look at on either side as you drive through. At the corner of the main street in Ovando is a small camping spot right behind the town museum, which is where Leia and 2 of her friends, Kim and Joe, decide to camp for the night. So after a long day of riding, they got their tents set up about 20 feet from one another and then got into bed early. But for whatever reason, maybe they figured it wouldn't be an issue because they were in the middle of town, they didn't store their food away from their tents. And unfortunately as well, Montana has by far the most grizzly bears anywhere in the US other than Alaska. So at 3 a.m., as everyone was fast asleep, Leia was woken up by the deep huff of a grizzly just a few feet from her head. Immediately, she started yelling that there was a bear, waking up Kim and Joe, who quickly sprung into action. Joe grabbed their bear spray and started yelling and making noise, and basically as they got out of the tent, the bear sort of sauntered off into the field across the street. This obviously freaked everyone out, so they all grabbed the food that they had left in their tents and moved it into a small building beside the museum about 30 feet from their camping spot. Kim and Joe asked Leia if she'd prefer to stay in a motel, but she declined and opted instead to take some bear spray into her tent with her. Then, once they'd all settled down and gotten back into their tents, they fell back asleep. About 45 minutes later, Joe was woken up to intense rustling coming from Leia's tent, but no noise or yelling from Leia, and he knew right away that she was being attacked by a bear. He started screaming that the bear was back and ripped open the tent zipper, roaring and spraying his bear spray, and right behind him, Kim was loudly blowing her whistle. From their tent, 20 feet away from Leia's, all they could see was the large silhouette of a bear bouncing up and down on Leia and her tent, and Leia wasn't making any noise despite the attack. Now in the case of specifically a grizzly bear attack, the advice often given is to play dead to try to make the grizzly lose interest. So from Joe and Kim's perspective, Leia might have been quiet on purpose. Then as they got closer, the bear looked at Joe, turned its head, and then ran off back into the field. Then as they approached Leia's tent, they could see that it had been completely flattened on one side, and Leia had been dragged about 10 feet or so and was lying lifelessly on the ground. Her body was still in the sleeping bag, and she had severe cuts and bite marks all over her head, neck, and back. And tragically, in just those few moments, the over 400-pound grizzly had attacked her so violently that it had severed her spine at her neck. This unfortunately killed her instantly. Emergency services quickly got there and did their best to revive her, but unfortunately, the damage was too severe, and Leia never woke up. After searching the tents and campground, they found 2 small bags of dried blueberries that Leia had forgotten inside. And 10 feet from their campground, in the saddlebags on her bike, leaned up against the museum wall, there was a bunch more food and snacks. Since the 70s, grizzly bears have been a protected species because of how small their population had become. In the past couple of decades, the population has rebounded, which makes encounters with them much more frequent. Generally, these encounters are totally benign, but because they are so massive, if one does attack, the results can be life-changing. Before automation, lighthouses and prisons were not so different. Just like prisoners are stuck in their cells until someone lets them out, lighthouse keepers were stuck on these tiny islands until a ship came to get them. And these are often just the tiniest of rocks in the middle of the ocean. The distances are too great and the waters are too cold and rough to swim, so they are completely stuck until transport arrives. This also means they are completely at the mercy of someone's goodwill and sense of obligation. In fact, in a way, lighthouses were much more isolated than any prison because for the individuals inside, there were often 0 people for dozens of miles in any direction. Granted, they were paid for this work, but that didn't always negate some of the psychological trauma inflicted on the keepers due to the extreme isolation. It's hard to tell exactly what lighthouse is the most remote because there aren't any lists compiled by distance, but one that would definitely make every list is Small's Lighthouse off the coast of Pembrokeshire, Wales. Other than Standard Lighthouse in Lake Superior, Small's Lighthouse is the farthest from people that I could find anywhere on Earth at 32 kilometers or 20 miles from the nearest inhabited area. And to really put the conditions here in perspective, the island that this lighthouse sits on is just a small rock that is less than the size of a basketball court. In stormy weather, the waves completely envelop this island and leave just the cylindrical tower visible, jutting out from the rock. It's also so far from the nearest land that if you stood on the top of the building and spun around, all you would see is the expansive ocean in every single direction. It is truly the definition of isolated. To add to this, even the tower isn't necessarily a refuge in the worst storms. In just mild waves, the rock is completely covered. In the worst storms, the waves are unbelievably large. Like for example, in 1831, the base of the tower sat around 15 meters or 50 feet off the rocks on large pillars. That year, a storm was so bad and the waves got so large that they smashed into the floor of the tower, causing it to break away and slam against the ceiling. And this was so violent that it caused the death of one of the keepers inside and injured all of the others. But despite how gruesome that event was, this story is about another incident. There was an event several decades earlier that was so traumatic that it caused the rules of lighthouse keeping to be changed forever. The original Smalls Lighthouse was completed in 1776 and was an octagonal building built on 8 massive 50-foot oak pillars. Later, when this proved not to be sturdy enough, one additional support was added in the middle, along with diagonal struts that went across from pillar to pillar, and then from the outside of the pillars down to the rocks below. In the rocks as well, a large tank was placed into the ground, which was separated into 2 compartments to hold coal and fresh water. The keepers then used a crane from one of the platforms to bring supplies directly up to the building, but for people to climb in, a rope ladder was fixed from the rocks to a trapdoor in the floor of the lower level of the building. This lower level was further divided into a series of rooms for storage, repairs, and a living quarters where the keepers lived and slept. Then above this room was the upper level that housed a large oil lantern and a series of reflectors. Originally fixed with just 4 lanterns, these consumed around 200 gallons of oil per year, but later when the tower was upgraded to 16, it consumed as much as 1,500 gallons a year. And this was to great effect because the light could be seen for up to 33 kilometers away. In 1801, there were 2 lighthouse keepers on duty named Thomas Howell and Thomas Griffith. Each of these men was married and had families, and apparently didn't get along well with one another. In town, they were known to dislike one another and to get into arguments, but for money and duty, they were placed together to man the lighthouse anyway. And during their stay, the weather was unusually bad. In fact, it was so bad that it would be 4 months before a ship could dock safely on the island. During those months, boats were sent over and over, but the water was just too treacherous each time, so the captains could never get close enough without risking getting smashed up against the rocks. About a month or so into this period, following a particularly bad storm, some of the ships going through the area noticed that the distress signal had been hoisted up from the lighthouse. Now at the time, this was just a nondescript signal. It didn't give any indication of who to send the signal to or what the issue was, just that something was wrong. And week after week, boats reported seeing this signal to the authorities along the coast. And every week in response, highly capable boats with highly experienced crew were sent to Small's Lighthouse. Their instructions were always to land if possible, but if not, get close enough to determine what the situation was. But week after week, the sea was so bad that they could only get close enough to see the dim outline of a man standing on the gallery of the lighthouse. It even occasionally looked as though he was waving to them. Unfortunately, they could never get close enough to hear if he was yelling or signaling anything in particular. Soon, weeks turned into months when storm after storm prevented any of the boats from docking on the island. During this time, the men were as isolated as anyone in history, with supplies that were slowly dwindling. The only reassurance to the families of the men and to the lighthouse company was that the distress signal didn't go out. This signal had to be maintained by someone, so naturally, this meant that someone was alive to maintain it. If it had gone out, this would have made the situation truly desperate, and still, boat after boat returned to see a man on the gallery. Finally, 4 months into their stay, the weather was clear enough to land on the island, and when it did, the reality was much worse than anyone could have imagined. Months earlier, shortly after being dropped off, Thomas Griffith got sick. It got to the point that he was so sick, the men felt it was necessary to get him off the lighthouse, so they raised the distress signal shortly after. Unfortunately, the weather prevented any help from coming, so Griffith slowly worsened until his death several weeks later. Initially, Thomas Howell kept the body inside the living quarters, but soon enough, the body started to decompose. Eventually, the odor and visual appearance became too much, and Howell was forced to come up with another plan. Ordinarily, it might make sense to simply throw him into the ocean, but because of their previous disagreements, Howell was worried this would cause him to be suspected of murder back on land. Instead, because he was a professional cooper, which is someone who makes barrels, he used some of the scrap wood from the structure to create a coffin for Griffith. When it was ready, he put the body inside and then carried it out to the platform along the gallery and tied it to a railing. For 3 weeks, this worked, but then between the rain and storms and wind, the coffin slowly degraded until it was stripped away entirely. Eventually, all that was left tied to the railing was Griffith's severely decomposed body, and it was positioned in such a way that it looked to passing boats as if someone was purposely standing there. And to Howell, sometimes when the wind blew just right, the arms looked as though they were waving to him. So for months, he sat alone in the middle of the ocean. There was no land in any direction, the sea was too rough for boats to land, but he could see them get close anyway, his food store slowly disappeared, and Griffith's decomposing body waved to him from the window. Over time, Howell slowly lost his mind, and this would go on for 4 months before he was finally rescued from his isolation. When they finally got to him, he was emaciated almost to the point of starvation, and his personality and appearance had completely changed. Apparently, it was so much so that upon returning home, friends and family barely recognized him, and it would take him years to fully recover. Following this incident, lighthouse policy was changed to ensure that lighthouses were always manned by at least 3 keepers instead of 2 to prevent anyone from ever going through that again. The original Smalls Lighthouse stood all the way until 1861, when it was replaced by the tower that stands in its place today. And this new tower was automated in 1987, so no one ever has to be as isolated as Thomas Howell during those months in 1801. On February 24th, 2020, a call was received by a 911 operator from a woman named Sarah. The operator asked what the location of the emergency was. Then the operator asked if the emergency was for police or medical, and abruptly, Sarah interjected and said, "My boyfriend is dead." The operator then said to stay on the line for the fire department and do not hang up. The woman then calmly explained that her and her boyfriend Jorge were playing the night before, and she put him in a suitcase because they were playing hide and seek. Then she accidentally fell asleep with him still inside, and when she woke up several hours later, he was dead, and she didn't know what had happened. Sarah and Jorge started dating in 2017, and almost right from the beginning, their relationship was very tumultuous. Only a few months into dating, they had moved in together, and their arguments escalated way beyond normal arguments to the point of extreme. Like for example, in 2018, about a year into dating, the two of them were at a bar, and Sarah asked another man at the bar for a cigarette. This shouldn't have been a big deal, but Jorge was furious and stormed out of the bar. Sarah went after him, and the two of them got into a heated argument on the way home, and by the time they got home, things had only escalated, and soon it got physical. It's not clear exactly what happened, since they both told the police different stories, with Sarah claiming that Jorge dragged her up the stairs and then kicked her in the face, and Jorge claiming to have been trying to go up the stairs when Sarah started choking him and he kicked her to get him off of her. When police got there, they each had marks and bruises on them, making it difficult to determine who the aggressor was, and on top of that, they both refused medical treatment and declined to press charges against one another. In the end, police charged each of them with battery, and then those cases fizzled out afterward. Despite this incident and their involvement with the police was not a deterrent at all, at least not for Jorge. The following year in 2019, another incident occurred similar to the first one, where Jorge was angry that Sarah talked to another guy, and things got physical once again. This time, it was pretty clear that Jorge was the one who initiated, or at the very least, attacked her in a much more one-sided way. Sarah ended up with bruises and marks all over her body, and Jorge even told her that she was going to die. This time, Sarah would press charges, and Jorge was taken to jail as a result. She then testified in court against him, and they were ordered to live separately. This again wasn't a deterrent when in the middle of the night, a couple months later, Jorge kicked in Sarah's bedroom door and attacked her in her bed. Amazingly, despite Sarah getting the police involved again, this case fizzled out too and was closed just a month later. The two of them even started living together, so it seems like maybe they reconciled and then Sarah dropped the charges. And this would be the last recorded incident before that fateful day 1 year later. After explaining to the telephone operator that the two of them were playing a game, the operator was confused and clarified. He seemed to think that the situation was different than what Sarah described because it was just so odd. She then curtly responded no and explained that she pulled him out of the suitcase and tried to give him CPR, but it didn't work. The operator then walked her through CPR once again as paramedics were sent to her house, and as the phone call continues, Sarah got more and more panicked. Eventually, the paramedics got to the house where they found Jorge lying on the ground in their living room and shortly after pronounced him dead. Then she explained the story again that the two of them had been drinking the night before, but that she wasn't drunk and thought it would be funny to put him in a suitcase. Somehow, she'd fallen asleep, and by the time she woke up, Jorge was dead. The police then asked to take her phone as evidence, and then they left her home. Later that day, they discovered something on her phone that would completely change their opinion about what happened and contradict her story. So much so that the following day, they returned to her home and arrested her on second-degree murder charges. I'm now going to play a short clip of the full video found, and to warn you again that although it is not graphic, it is still highly disturbing.
Sarah.
For everything you've done to me.
Sarah.
For everything you've done to me.
Sarah.
F you.
Sarah.
F you.
Sarah.
Stupid.
Sarah.
That's my name. Don't wear it up.
Sarah. I can't breathe, babe. Seriously.
Yeah, that's when you do when you choke me.
Sarah. 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 Sarah, I can't breathe, babe.
That's on you.
Sarah, I can't breathe.
It's on you.
Sarah.
As you just saw, Jorge was in extreme distress, and Sarah didn't care at all. The full video is around 2 minutes long and is not the only video she took that night. In another video, the suitcase is facing up in a different part of the room, and Jorge can still be heard calling Sarah's name, and he is clearly panicked. The longer video is obviously the more striking of the two, because during it, Sarah can be heard laughing and taunting him. She tells him to shut up, and this is how she feels when he cheats on her and chokes her, and throughout the entire thing, Jorge is calling her name and telling her he can't breathe. And very clearly as well, she is slurring her words much more than she claimed to police. These videos were taken at around 11 p.m. the night before, and after Sarah got bored of taunting him, she left him in the tiny suitcase and went to her bed to go to sleep. She then slept until around 11 a.m. the following day, leaving Jorge in the suitcase for almost 12 hours. At some point during this, he died of positional asphyxiation, which is essentially where you don't have enough room to breathe properly, and eventually you suffocate as a result. When she woke up the next morning, she claimed to have not known where he was until she realized what had happened. Then when she finally unzipped the suitcase, he was cold and purple, but rather than call paramedics right away, she called her ex-husband who lived nearby, and as soon as he got there, he told her to call 911 right away. Then, finally at 1 p.m., 2 hours after she woke up and found Jorge not breathing, she finally made the call, but by then, it was obviously far too late. If you made it this far, I just want to thank you for watching. Just a quick reminder that I am now taking viewer-submitted stories, so if you have any true stories that you think would fit this channel, I'd love to hear them. You can send them to me by email found in the description, and the more detailed the better. There is also a Scary Interesting subreddit where you can submit any stories you've come across that you think might fit the channel. It's a bit easier for me to sort through them this way. So once again, thank you so much for watching, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.